All right, so we've got a 1992 Ford F-250. Definitely old, but it's still fuel injected. It's got the 5.8 liter fuel injection, has a throttle position sensor and an idle air control motor, just like any other car on the road. Issue we're having is at random, when it feels like it. At idle, it'll have a high idle. It'll rev up to 2,000, 2,500 RPM, and then it'll go back down, rev back up, and then sometimes it'll just stay at 1,500 RPM, and then you rev it up and it goes back up to a high idle, even higher. So what I noticed at first was we've got our lever here for the throttle body to open and close the throttle plates to let more air into the engine. You can kind of see them moving there. And this piece right here is our idle air control motor. So what it does is at idle, the computer allows more air to flow past the throttle plate to keep it at the desired speed. And what I would do at first is I would unplug the idle air control motor with it running, of course, and then it would idle down to about 500 RPM. After doing that for a couple of times, leaving it unplugged, the computer just learned that, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to idle at 500 RPM. And the moment you plug it back in, it revs back up. And what most people would think is, oh, well, shit, it must be my idle air control motor. I'll get a new one, put it on. Well, I just bought this truck, and looking at that idle air control motor, it sure looks like somebody replaced that not too long ago. It doesn't look as corroded as all the other parts around it. So the throttle position sensor is right down in here, that white piece there on this particular vehicle. And I have the ground wire and the signal wire probe. Now this sensor runs off of a 5-volt signal, so the computer supplies a ground to the sensor, it supplies 5 volts to the sensor, and then the sensor spits back a voltage to the computer, and it's variable depending on what position the throttle plate is in, at least when it works properly. Now, right now, this vehicle is key on, engine off. Obviously, it's not running. I have the signal wire probed, and when you're at idle and the throttle plate is closed, the voltage should be, on this vehicle, I believe, below 1 volt. Definitely below 1 volt. I can tell you that for sure. And maxed out, it's right around 4.9 to 5 volts. Give or take, when you have the throttle all the way to the floor. And right now, sitting at idle, well, quote unquote, what would be idle, we are at 3.3 volts. So that would explain our high idle and why at random this vehicle will rev up to 2,500 RPM at idle, because the computer thinks that the throttle plate is open when it's not. And the reason why unplugging that idle air control motor solves the issue, I guess you could call it a quick fix for the time being, is because the computer thinks that the throttle plate is opened up, but it's not. So it compensates for that by opening up the idle air control motor instead to allow more air to get in the engine, to rev this engine up to the desired RPM based off of what the throttle position sensor is telling the computer. So just kind of a weird problem. I know this is an older vehicle, but it still has a throttle position sensor just like any other vehicle. We have new cars being produced today with throttle position sensors. So there you go. Definitely not supposed to be that high. Below 1 volt for the signal wire.